Hey guys, it's Dawn, and today we are going to be doing some distress ink watercoloring. If you follow me on Instagram, then you know that one of my other hobbies is traditional watercolor. Now, the watercolor supplies can get quite expensive, but I love the look of it, so I'm always looking for ways to incorporate this into my card making and crafting in a way that's simple and uses supplies that you probably already have on hand. So I'm going to do a two-part series, and in the first one we're going to be creating these two cards, and I would consider this a beginner, maybe a little more into the intermediate level, and then in the second video we're going to cover some more advanced techniques. Now, this is a really fun technique, and like I said, you probably have most of these supplies on hand. Let's take a look at some of them. You'll need a lined image stamp, which means it's open-centered and you can color it in. You'll also need watercolor paper. Any weight's fine. I prefer 140 pound. You'll need a watercolor brush. Now, this is where I'm going to tell you to splurge. You can get crafting brushes for really cheap, a big bunch in a pack for a couple of dollars, but it's going to cost you so much in wasted paper and frustration. Just spend a couple extra dollars, get yourself a really good brush. I personally like the number 4 round for working in these small areas, but trust me, in the long run, you will spend less money and you'll be so much happier with your work. You're going to need distress inks. Now, this is important because these react with water and they're going to act very similarly to a watercolor pigment. Finally, you'll need clean water and paper towels. I've already stamped out my panels here to save some time. For both of them, I've used the butterfly from our Flora and Fauna 1 stamp set. For the dark version, I just stamped that in Memories dye ink and black. Now this ink is waterproof, which is important since we'll be adding a lot of water to this. And then on the emboss side, I use the Wow Detail White embossing powder. And you'll want to make sure that your embossing powder is very finely milled. Watercolor paper has a lot of texture, so you want to make sure that it gets into those nooks and crannies, and the finer milled it is, the better embossing results you're going to get. My watercolor paper of choice is the Strathmore 140 pound watercolor paper, and you can pick this up at any of your big box stores. So we're going to start with the embossed one, and we'll be using the Tim Holtz Distress Ink markers. Now, normally I would lay down water first and then add my pigment, but these markers, you can't do that. You have to lay down the color first. They won't go over water. Ask me how I know. So it's better to add the color first, and then we're going to come in and add our water to move it around. So I'm just scribbling in here in the innermost area, and I'm going to zoom in really close so you guys can see exactly what's going on here. Now I'm concentrating the color heavy where I want it to be the darkest. And then as I come out into the rest of the wing here, I'm just going to flick some color. What's going to happen is I'm going to create a bleed or a nice soft haze with the water when I go to add it. So you'll just fill in your color. And I'm not taking any care to not go over the embossing. That embossing will resist any of this color, and I can come back in with my paper towel afterwards and dab off anything. And you can see that's good as new now, and there's no residual color left on there. Now I'm going to wet my paintbrush, and then I'm just going to go over these darker parts. Now what this is going to do is wherever I touch it with the water is going to force the ink to separate, and it's going to create what's called a bloom. In watercolor, when you drop water into a concentrated area of pigment, the water will start pushing all of that color to the edges. And so it'll be nice and translucent in the middle, and then it'll dry to a really dark, heavy edge, and that's what they call a bloom. To get these nice soft fades, you'll notice that I'm starting with the water on the side where there's no color, and then I'm pushing it over to where the color starts. Again, what this is going to do is that water is going to grab the edge of that ink and it's going to pull it into the water. The great thing about watercolor paper is because of the texture and everything, your pigment will only go where there is water sitting on the paper. So if you don't want any color to go into a certain area, just don't wet it. Wherever you lay down water and wherever the paper is wet, that color will continue to bleed into those areas and until it bleeds into, clean white water. So again, here you can see I'm just touching the edges where there is no color and then pushing it into the area where I have already laid down color. The areas that are really dark, I'm just adding a little bit of water to them to get that little bit of movement in there so it doesn't look really solid like I colored it in with a marker. Another neat trick about watercolor is that you can actually lift out color. So you can do that two ways. You can take your brush and dry it off, and it'll be what you call a thirsty brush, and then dip it into the wet area and it'll soak up that extra pigment. Or you can take a paper towel and just blot it. And again, that will absorb some of that water and that color along with it. So here you can see I'm just going to tap these really lightly and I've pulled out a lot of that color. So once I've got this first wash of color down, I can clean up any excess water off of this embossed area. And again, I'm dabbing here, not smearing. If I were to wipe this, it would wipe that pigment over onto my paper, and I don't want that. So I'm going to be careful here to dab it off. Now once this wash is completely dry, I can come in and add another wash of color. It can be the same color or it can be a different color. And while this one's drying, I can go ahead and get started on the initial washes for the other butterflies. Once it's dry, we can go ahead and add our second color. A good way to tell is to touch it with the back of your hand or your finger. If the paper feels cool to the touch, then it's not completely dry yet. But if it doesn't feel any different than the rest of the paper, then it's dry and you can go ahead and get started. For my second wash of color, I'm layering worn lipstick directly over that wild honey. At first glance, it looks like I'm completely covering up all of that nice saturated honey color. But what I want to do here is create a vibrant orange. So I'm laying this pinkish reddish color over top of a yellow, and when we add the water, it's going to allow those two to mix, and it's going to become this nice vibrant orange. Using the same technique as before, I'm going to take clean water and I'm going to start adding it to the side where there isn't any ink. Again, that's going to pull that color, that ink, out towards the water, but it's going to leave it super concentrated at the other edge. And here you can see how they start blending and bleeding together, and they just create this nice variation of a vibrant deep orange and then kind of a light coral color. I'm just going to repeat the same thing on the other wing. And how much time and detail you take to do this is really up to you. You could just slide the brush right over it and be done with it, or you can try to have a little more control. Now, the thing that I've learned about watercolor is you don't want to try to have control. The more control you try to take over watercolor, the less successful you're going to be and the more frustrated you're going to get. Watercolor is kind of a free spirit, and it's best just to try not to control it. Remember, the key is to let areas dry before you come back to them. So now that this wing is dry again, I can come in here and add a little bit more here and there wherever I want to add more color. While this one dries, I can move on to the other butterflies and repeat the same steps. To create that sky-like background, we're going to be using tumbled glass, and we're literally going to be just scribbling on the paper and then laying down lots of water. You will want to work in sections. I've noticed that once the markers dry, they're not as easy to manipulate with the water. Now, the Distress ink pads, you can get away with doing larger areas and then manipulating it. For some reason, the markers, once they're dry, they're a lot harder to move. So I would recommend working in small portions like I've done here. So once I've got some color down, I'm going to take and add water to my paper. Now you could use a bigger brush for this, but I wanted to show you how you could do it all with pretty much the same brush. I'm going to start moving that water toward my objects. Wherever I want that ink or that pigment to move to or bleed into, I'm going to add water to it. Remember, it won't go anywhere on the paper where the paper is dry. So you can encourage the movement and kind of control where that ink goes by wetting different areas of your paper. If you really want to make objects stand out, like for instance the white outline on this butterfly, you'll want to concentrate heavy color along the edge. So here I'm adding some of that ink directly up against the edge, and then I'm just going to pull some of it out using the water. This is going to create a nice crisp hard edge up against that white and really make it pop. And then you'll just continue adding water and pulling it. If you want to encourage the water to move, you can set your paper at a slight incline. Here, this is so little. Normally I would tape this to a wooden board and then I would prop it up if I were doing a traditional watercolor painting. But this is just a card and it's such a small size that I can just prop it up on an ink pad here. So I've just taken a Versamark pad and propped it up at an angle, and this will encourage that water to move down as I add it to the paper. So here's another up-close view of how that water can move that ink around and help spread it and create all those nice transitions and blends. I'm going to continue in the same manner, adding ink and then adding water and moving it around until I get my background exactly how I want it, until I'm happy with it. You can just keep working the background, and once you're satisfied with how it looks, you can just put it off to the side to dry and then incorporate it into a card. So here we have two examples of Distress Ink watercoloring, and here we've incorporated the stamped image into the watercolor design. Now for the white one, I chose to keep the colors minimal and soft and airy, but for the darker one, I was able to use a much more vibrant color palette and deepen that background because I knew those black butterflies would be able to hold their own against all that color. I really hope you enjoyed this technique. I just love the way that it really emulates a watercolor. It's super easy and you don't have to know how to sketch or draw anything out because the stamps really create the image for you. The watercoloring adds so much interest that really all you have to do is add a sentiment and mount these on a card base and you're done. In the next video, I'll show you how to use a stamp as your guide, except you won't have any visible stamping lines whatsoever, so it'll end up looking like a traditional watercolor. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, you can find any of our featured Wplus9 supplies at Wplus9.com, and you can connect with us on our blog at stampawaywithme.blogspot.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Instagram. Thanks so much. See you next time.